1943. Studied philosophy at King College, Oxfordshire, and classics in English literature at Campion Hall, Oxford. Milward arrived in Japan in 1954 and studied theology at St. Mary's College in Kamishakuchi, Tokyo. In 1962, he joined the faculty of the literature department at Sabai University in Tokyo. On retiring from Sabai University in 1996, he served as Dean of the Faculty of Culture at Tokyo Junshin Women's College until 2000. He is a Professor Emeritus at Sabai University. Among his many books and monographs are The Introduction to Shakespeare's Plays, Shakespeare's Religious Background, Biblical Themes in Shakespeare, The Religious Controversies of the Elizabethan Age, and The Religious Controversies of the Jacobean Age. It's my great pleasure to present now Father King.
In England, we always begin a formal speech on such an occasion with the words, "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen." So I'm sure that among this audience there are lords and ladies and gentlemen. At least I hope you'll be sufficiently gentlemanly to listen to my few words till the very end without getting up in disgust and but maybe if you feel like that, you might as well fall asleep. That's what I tell my students back in Japan, because my voice tends to lull them to sleep, especially in the afternoon period. And so I say, well, you're free to fall asleep, provided you don't snore. I can't tolerate snoring, but I don't mind if you sleep quietly. My main purpose in coming here and speaking is to delete the question mark at the end of the I've always think of Hamlet as overshadowed by the ghost in the form of a question mark. And I'm afraid the ghost had a bad influence on poor, I was going to say William Shakespeare, but at least poor Hamlet. So who is the ghost? That is the question. Anyhow, I'm not going to speak about Hamlet today. If you want to hear me on Hamlet, I will be coming back to America and giving a seminar on metadrama in Hamlet at a place called Mecosta in Michigan, in the wilds of Michigan. Last year I was giving a similar seminar in the same place, and there's a separation between the place where I was speaking and the place where I was staying, and we had to return by car, and I'm afraid we lost our way in the middle of the night, in the middle of the Michigan countryside, so we didn't know where we were, but somehow we managed to find our way to the right place. Somehow. I think somehow is a favorite word of the Holy Spirit. Now, if you will forgive me for reading what I have prepared, because I like to make sure that my words remain within a certain limit of time. If I don't write out what I have to say, I might go on till midnight, or until nobody is left in this room. Anyhow, my topic is Catholic King Lear. Before I get down to speaking about the Catholicism of Shakespeare's King Lear, I have 3 preliminary remarks to make in honor of the Holy Trinity. I think Shakespeare too has the same devotion to the Holy Trinity, because if you look carefully at his plays, you find the words are always arranged in triplets. Shakespeare is very fond of triplets, and I've become fond of triplets in the same way and for the same reason. The first is a word of warning from Shakespeare himself, from his problem comedy of Measure for Measure. Into the mouth of the cheeky Lucio, he puts the odd characterization of Duke Vincenzo, which may well be applied to the dramatist himself. His givings out were of an immense distance from his true meant design. His givings out, what he actually said, were of an immense distance from what he really meant to say. In other words, you can't take Shakespeare on his face value. These words may be compared with those of George Herbert, who complains in his poem Jordan of other poets, probably Shakespeare, who require their readers to catch the sense at 2 removes. In other plainer words, in reading or hearing the plays of Shakespeare, we need an intelligence to read between the lines, such as taxes the minds of not a few critics and producers nowadays. I'm afraid nowadays a majority of Shakespeare scholars, Shakespeare critics, Shakespeare producers are too lazy to read between the lines. They just read on the lines. My second remark is also derived from Shakespeare, from the words he puts into the mouth of Hippolyta in A Midsummer Night's Dream. After hearing the story of the night as told by the Athenian lovers, she wonders, in the face of her husband's doubt, how it all more witnesses than fancies images, and grows to something of great constancy. It more witnesses than fancies images, and grows to something of great constancy. Her husband, Theseus, is a rationalist, but rationalists are so narrow-minded. Being a woman, she is much broader-minded than most men. I'm sorry for the gentleman reading. With Shakespeare, I would have learned feminist, not in the modern sense of the word feminist, but in the old-fashioned word meaning. The same process of feminine reasoning we find in Newman's Grammar of Assent, in his objection to the male logic of such thinkers as Aristotle and Descartes, who turn everything into a shadow of itself. In Latin, omnibus umbra logis. Newman is very critical of the scholastic Latin of his time, as usually to which seminarians were accustomed, not only then, but even in my own period of formation. And in his insistence on a method of proof, such as enters into the assent of faith by a convergence of independent probabilities that depend on an open mind. So you have this probability, and that probability, and that probability, but each one is independent. And then they all point to some hidden center. And this hidden center is faith. And in my idea of Shakespeare, it is the faith of William Shakespeare. You need an open mind to recognize the Catholicism of William Shakespeare, because you can't prove it by Aristotelian reasoning. It has to be following the method of proof shown by John Henry Newman in his Grammar of Assent. My third remark, which is also a word of warning, is derived not so much from Shakespeare himself as from T.S. Eliot in speaking about Shakespeare's plays in comparison with the poetry of Dante. In his essay on the latter, on Dante, he refers to a pattern in the carpet of Shakespeare, an image he in turn derives from a novel by Henry James. That is to say, in order to understand any play of Shakespeare's, one has, unlike the scholars who have chosen to deal with individual plays, as in the Arden edition, to consider all the plays together. The light they have to show on one another, but the dramatist himself is always repeating himself in one way or another, as he asks himself in Sonnet 74, why write I still all one, ever the same? So often people emphasize Coleridge's idea of Shakespeare's myriad-mindedness. Well, Shakespeare has many things to say and many characters through whom to say them. There is so much variety, and yet behind and within all the different variety there is an implicit unity, and that is Shakespeare. Why write I still all one, ever the same? The Latin word is semper idem, always the same. Therefore, instead of limiting my attention to the one play of King Lear, or rather, in order to deal more appropriately with that one play, and to show what I mean by reading between the lines of the play, I wish to present it as a third in a series of 3 plays, always in triplets. Not as a third in a series of 3 Jacobean tragedies. Everybody knows the 4 great tragedies beginning with Hamlet. This was the idea of Andrew Bradley in his famous lectures on Shakespeare's 4 great tragedies. But Bradley did not understand Shakespearean tragedy. I'm sorry to say so, because Hamlet is different from all the others. Hamlet stands by itself, but the 3 Jacobean tragedies of which I'm speaking are Othello, Macbeth, and King Lear. So these 3 tragedies may best be described as Shakespeare's passion play. Hamlet is not a passion play, but these 3 tragedies are passion plays, or one passion play. But what I'm going to speak about are 3 plays of disinheritance, which cut across the traditional division of comedies, histories, and tragedies, and across the reigns of Elizabeth Tudor and James Stuart. I mean, the history play of Richard II, the comedy of As You Like It, about which we have already heard in considerable detail, and King Lear. All what these 3 plays share in common is the theme of disinheritance, with precise reference, as I read them, to the sad situation of Catholic recusants in Elizabethan England. If you ignore the presence and the influence of the Catholic recusants in Elizabethan England, you just cannot understand the meaning of Shakespeare. And I affirm this in face of the unwilling and uncooperative Shakespeare establishment, both here in America and there in England. And so I lead up to my presentation of King Lear as an essentially Catholic play, provided one looks beyond the outward shows of gold and silver in the flattering speeches of Gondel and Regan to the truth of the leaden silence of Cordelia. in today's presentation of Hamlet, I particularly emphasize the words of Hamlet to the Queen. "Seems, madam, nay it is, I know not, seems." These words are so important for understanding not only of Hamlet, but of all Shakespeare. Shakespeare is always hiding himself. He is playing hide and seek with people like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. They would try to pluck out the heart of his mystery. But what you need to find the mystery of Shakespeare is what he also calls the brooch of love. You have to love Shakespeare, and you have to love what Shakespeare stands for. And so I begin with Richard II. Only I begin with the seemingly sad ending of the play, with the scene in which the deposed and disinherited king is being led to prison in the Tower. Then, on the way, he meets his sorrowing queen, Isabella. Just as Jesus, on the way of the cross, meets his sorrowing mother, Mary. And as more, on his way to the Tower from his sentence of condemnation at Westminster Hall, meets his sorrowing daughter, Margaret. There, Richard stops and advises her, "Hie thee to France, and cloister thee in some religious house. Our holy lives must win a new world's crown." For such an audience this evening, New World has a special meaning. And New World, brave New World, comes from Shakespeare. The Tempest, the words of the innocent Miranda, "O brave New World that has such creatures in it." But there are two meanings in Shakespeare's New World. Shakespeare's emphasis is on a new world, not like those of the Indies, whether to the east or the west, nor like that other secular new world in which sycophants like Lord Fitzwater seek to thrive, but a world of the spirit which can only be entered by the way of the cross. Such, too, is a new world recommended by Moore, if not to his daughter, who is already married to William Roper, and who has to accompany him with her father's sever head to Canterbury, at least to many of his female descendants who took to the religious life in the Low Countries. And I particularly mentioned the Benedictine Dom Gertrude Moore, who was a descendant of St. Thomas More. Secondly, the implications of this moment in Richard II are developed at length in the comedy of As You Like It, with its setting in the forest of Arden, a setting that may be identified as at once Shakespeare's own forest of Arden in Warwickshire, and as the mountainous forest of the Ardennes rising behind the Low Countries. Here, on the one hand, we may recognize the enclave of such Catholic families as the Ardens, the Throckmortons, the Catesbys, the Grants, and the Habingtons, from among whom came not a few of the future conspirators for the gunpowder plot of 1605. Shakespeare was living in a nest of conspirators. But the forest of Arden in Shakespeare's play is oddly infested with not a few mysterious old religious men. I think those old religious men were Jesuits. And there, on the other hand, I'm sorry to slightly disagree with Claire Asquith on this matter. We may recognize the English College of Douay. In France, of course, they say Douay, but in England we say Douay. Also, the English Abbey of Dowie, founded by Dr. William Arden for the education of young Catholics, were described in the play as flocking to him every day, and for the time being treating the time carelessly as they did in the Golden World, before returning to suffer and die as martyrs in their native England. There too, those who go out to join the exiled Duke, who significantly remains without a name in contrast to his usurping brother Frederick, have to forfeit their lands and revenues, and so they are disinherited. It's interesting that the Duke has no name. His brother is given the name of Frederick, but he's just the elder Duke, Duke Senior. But I can agree with Claire that Shakespeare probably had more than one model in his mind for his characters. So also Sir William Stanley may very well qualify as the exiled Duke, especially as one of the, on the right side of Sir William Stanley is Captain Jakes or Jaques. In the play we have no fewer than 2 Jaques. Such is the setting of the play. The land of exile, into which the good characters, centering, needless to say, on the hero and heroine, Orlando and Rosalind, are successively driven by the bad ones, Orlando's brother and Rosalind's uncle, the usurping Duke. It's also interesting, as has been pointed out, that you have not only 2 Jaques, but also 2 Olivers. There's this Oliver and Oliver Martext, and then there are 2 Rolands, or Orlando is the same as Roland. So Shakespeare doesn't mind repeating names in the same play. Here, first Orlando is accompanied by his faithful servant, the old Arden, acted probably by Shakespeare himself, in whom he admires the constant service of the antique world when service sweat for duty, not for need. Like so many of the servers and helpers on this occasion, they are sweating for duty and not for any financial reward, I may suppose. Or maybe they do. But their main purpose is to help us. And so I've been thanking them for their kindness in helping us, because any conference like this depends upon the people behind the scenes. In such words, Shakespeare expresses the feeling of nostalgia for the good old days which pervades the play, not least when the 2 come upon the Duke and his loving lords round their campfire in the forest, and they look back on better days when, among other things, bells have knolled to church. Good old days, Catholic days of merry England when bells knolled people to church, but now the bells have largely been silenced. Such too we may remember from Richard II, when the aged John of Gaunt looks back to the good old days of this England, in contrast to the time whether of the young Richard or the old Elizabeth, who famously recognized herself in Richard. Secondly, when the usurping, by the way, it's interesting to notice this speech, this England, which Graham Greene took as a field of praise for England as a form of English jingoism, expresses John of Gaunt's lament over Richard's England and Shakespeare's lament over Elizabeth's England. Secondly, when the usurping Duke banishes his niece Rosalind, he treats her as a traitor, and in reply to her protests, he declares, this has already been pointed out, thus to all traitors, if their purgation did consist in words, they are as innocent as grace itself. his words strangely echo those of the arch-persecutor of Catholic recusants, Sir William Cecil, in his pamphlet on the execution of justice in England, 1583. It has been in all ages and in all countries a common usage of all offenders, for the most part, both great and small, to make defense of their lewd and unlawful facts by untruths, and by coloring and covering their deeds, were they never so vile, with pretenses of some other causes. Cecil is characteristically long-winded. Shakespeare puts the same ideas in a very short space. Because, after all, Cecil finds a new life in the person of Polonius. Thirdly, when Rosalind goes into exile, she goes not alone but in company with her friend, the usurping Duke's daughter, Celia, I almost said Cecile, who remarks, "Now go we in content to liberty and not to banishment," a reflection often to be found on the lips, whether of recusants going into exile or of Catholic authors comforting them on their way into exile. So they are banished, but England has been banished from the Catholic faith, and so they're going into freedom, not banishment, by leaving England. Finally, from the end of Richard II and the beginning of As You Like It, we may at last turn with new understanding to the tragedy of King Lear. Here, once again, from the outset of the play, we come upon the familiar situation of banishment and disinheritance. At first in the case of Cordelia and her loyal defender, the Earl of Kent. Then, like the sorrowing queen of Richard II, she turns to France, whose king welcomes her in words comparing her to the man of sorrows. Fairest Cordelia, that art most rich being poor, most choice forsaken, and most loved despised. As you may remember, the man of sorrows is Christ himself, who is despised and rejected of men, forsaken even by his heavenly Father on the cross. As for Kent, when following her into exile, he echoes the above-quoted words of Celia, "Freedom lives hence, and banishment is here," while vowing, as if in response to the deposed Richard, to shape his old course in a country new. It is moreover the situation we find in the parallel plot of the Earl of Gloucester, whose bastard son Edmund contrives the banishment of his good, legitimate brother Edgar. Then we find Edgar described in terms precisely reminiscent of the hunted priests in Elizabethan England. Proclamations are made against him. Seaports are watched for his attempted escape. Intelligence is given where he is hidden. He is driven to take to the disguise of the mad beggar Tom O'Bedlam, saying, as if echoing the exiled Duke in As You Like It, "Edgar, I nothing am." He's no longer Edgar, just as the elder Duke is no longer what he used to be. His is precisely the situation of one such priest, Edmund Campion, who describes himself in a letter to the Jesuit general in Rome. "I cannot long escape the hands of the heretics. The enemy have so many eyes, so many tongues, so many scouts and crafts. I am in apparel to myself very ridiculous. I often change my name also. Threatening edicts, that is, proclamations, come forth against us daily. What is more, in his disguise as a mad beggar, Edgar is characterized by the dramatist in terms that are taken from a contemporary pamphlet by Samuel Harsnett entitled A Declaration of Egregious Popish Impostures, published in 1604, the year before the composition of King Lear, concerning exorcisms conducted in certain recusant houses to the north of London in the 1580s by the Jesuit William Weston and Shakespeare's former classmate from Stratford, Robert Debdale, who subsequently became a martyr. One of Shakespeare's own classmates became a martyr. Another of his schoolmasters, John Cotton, had a brother, Thomas, who became a martyr with Edmund Campion. Shakespeare was in the middle, not only of Catholic gentlemen in the forest of Arden, but also in the middle of Jesuit martyrs. He was surrounded by Jesuit martyrs and other Jesuits who managed to elude the authorities. Still, it isn't only Cordelia and Edgar. The good daughter of Lear and the good son of Gloucester were wrongly banished by their deceived parents. But their parents are also undeceived and driven into exile by their own children. Now, in place of the forest of As You Like It, onto a lonely moor or heath, a blasted heath, where for many miles about there's scarce a bush. On the one hand, Lear is punished for having, like the deposed Richard, relied on the flattery of his false-starved daughters, and for having, as Regan remarks, but slenderly known himself. And so he has to grow in self-knowledge in the school of adversity. There are those who belong to the other school of absurdity, who maintain that Shakespeare is an illustration of the theatre of the absurd. But Lear is not absurd. Lear is full of deep meaning. Lear has to grow in self-knowledge. And he grows in self-knowledge under 3 tutors. The first tutor is the fool, who is as faithful to his exiled master as Touchstone is to his exiled mistress, Celia. He both symbolizes the folly of Lear as Lear's shadow in answer to Lear's question, who is it that can tell me who I am? This is the lingering question of Lear. Who am I? Hamlet's question is, what is a man? But what is a man is a very unimportant question. The really important question is, who am I? And the answer in 99% of cases is, you are a fool. Shakespeare, one of Shakespeare's favorite quotations from the Bible is Ecclesiastes 1:14, where it speaks of fools, the multitude is infinite. Infinity of fools. And this was the favorite quotation of Erasmus in his praise of folly. But the Protestants couldn't endure the thought that the multitude of men are fools, and so they changed this sentence to something that is not so easily, not so readily understood. Of course, the Protestants were relying on the Hebrew original, the Catholics were relying on the Greek Septuagint. The second tutor, so the fool stands for the silent wisdom of Cordelia. So the fool and Cordelia are interchangeable, as the same character could take the part of Cordelia in the beginning, and then a fool in the middle, and then when Cordelia comes back, the fool disappears. So Cordelia is the wisdom of Lear, the fool is the folly of Lear. And so the wisdom becomes folly, but then once again, Lear returns to wisdom under the tuition, first of the fool, secondly of the madman, Edgar, in whom Lear sees his ideal philosopher, if in terms of Greek wisdom, with possible reference to the Stoic Diogenes, who likewise set the world at naught, and from whom he learns the precious lesson of patience. And this is a lesson I've had to learn over the past 57 years of my life in Japan. Once I heard a retreat given by Cardinal Montini of Milan, a Jesuit cardinal, and he quoted the words of a fellow cardinal to the effect that for a missionary there are three important qualities. And the first, he said, was patience. Just as St. Paul in his Hymn of Love says, the first quality for husband and wife is patience. You need to be patient over a long period of time. But then, secondly, patience. And then thirdly, of course, patience. Patience. Finally, Lear comes to himself in the tent of Cordelia, in whom he recognizes his true self, according to a name in French as Cœur de Lear. Cordelia is heart of Lear, Cœur de Lear. In analogy with the first King Richard, surnamed Cœur de Lion, the lion-hearted, to whose valor on the Third Crusade John of Gaunt was looking back in his nostalgia for this England. Then Lear explains, do not laugh at me, for as I am a man, I think this lady to be my child Cordelia. And then through her tears she answers, and so I am. Only a day or two before, somebody was asking me, what lines in Shakespeare are your favorite lines? Without hesitation, I quoted these lines, beginning, do not laugh at me. And there I pause. Do not laugh. For as I am a man, I think this lady to be my child Cordelia. And she answers, and so I am, all unconsciously for her, but not unconsciously for Shakespeare, echoing the divine name revealed to Moses, I am. And that's the whole point of a certain book, which you may still see lingering in the book display. It's with a simple title of God. And the publisher herself is present here because she brought these books all the way from Georgia to Portsmouth. And it's simply entitled God, beginning with the words of God to Moses, I am. Maybe God himself was shedding tears at the time he said, he gave this precious name to Moses, I am. And yet, everybody here can say, I am who I am. I am so-and-so. But God says, I am simply, directly, without qualification, with capital letters. And so we come to the climax of King Lear, which is the climax of my Catholic interpretation of the play. Here we have what is surely unique in all world drama, a combination of a supremely happy ending at the end of Act 4 and an unutterably sad ending at the end of Act 5. No one in all world history, I think, has had the courage to put supreme happiness together with supreme sadness. Shakespeare is the specialist in joy and sorrow. And so we are faced with a problem of how to reconcile these two seeming opposites. On one hand, those who remain on the surface of outward shows, such as the majority of Shakespeare critics and producers who fight shy of religion, can only see an absurdity, a cruelty, a meaninglessness, which they also see in human life outside the limits of the play. Then everything is absurd, and King Lear is the climax of such absurdity. On the other hand, when we see King Lear as third in line of succession, not only of the three plays of disinheritance, but also a seemingly secular passion play following on Othello and Macbeth, then the biblical echoes are obvious to anyone who knows the Bible. I'm afraid the majority of Shakespearean critics and producers seem to have no knowledge of the Bible, quite apart from sharing the Catholic faith with the dramatist. First, there are so many echoes in this play, as also in Hamlet, from the Old Testament book of Job. Lear himself, in his outcast situation, sees himself as a man more sinned against than sinning, and he is determined, like Job, to be the pattern of all patience. Secondly, there are other echoes from Shakespeare's favourite parable of the prodigal son, in which it is Lear who is the prodigal father, transforming the graced palace of Goneril into a riotous inn, and who is welcomed back as this child-changed father by his forgiving daughter. Shakespeare is so skillful in transposing genders and in transposing ages. In the Bible, you may have a young, innocent son, and in Shakespeare you have a young, innocent son held in the arms of his grieving mother. In Shakespeare you have a young, innocent daughter held in the arms of a grieving father. Thirdly, the last two acts are filled with a series of broken hearts, centering on what Edgar calls this side-piercing sight of the two old men, one blinded, the other maddened, meeting each other and recognizing each other, and recalling the episode of the crucifixion when a soldier with his lance pierces the side of Christ, and there flows out a stream of blood and water. This is echoed again and again, the broken heart, the pierced side, in Acts 4 and 5. And all this leads on to the further moment when Lear comes on stage at the end of the play with the dead body of Cordelia crying, "Howl, howl, 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 O you men of stones." And that's what Shakespeare is crying to all the people in the auditorium. Shakespeare is so indignant against the English audiences of his time. They all collaborated with the wicked Queen Elizabeth in changing the face of England. And when he relapses into silence, that silence is broken by Albany with the exclamation, "O sea, sea." Then who is so blind or deaf as not to recognize the echo from Jeremiah's lamentation, "Behold and see, if there be any sorrow like unto my sorrow." Words which the dramatist derives not just from the Bible, but also from the Church's liturgy for Holy Week, where they are twice used with reference to the sorrowing mother holding the dead body of Jesus in the figure known in Catholic art as the Pietà. Everything in Shakespeare leads up to King Lear. Everything in King Lear leads up to this final moment of the Pietà, in which Mary and Jesus are transposed into the outward forms of Lear and Cordelia. But then one may ask, Aren't all these references to the passion and death of Christ merely biblical, such as would have appealed no less to the Protestant than to the Catholic members of Shakespeare's original audience? All I have to say is that considering the play of King Lear as a whole and its relation to the preceding plays of Disinheritance, quite apart from the preceding plays of the Passion, Shakespeare is looking not only back to the story of the Gospels, which is set in the distant land of Israel 1500 years before, but to his own memory of the history of Catholic recusancy in Elizabethan England. Shakespeare was born only 5 years after the accession of Queen Elizabeth, and he has seen it all, experienced it all, suffered it all. This may be seen as entering into all his plays, from the early Comedy of Errors to the concluding Tempest, as interpreted in the light of Pascal's subsequently stated thought in the Pensée that Jesus Christ is in agony till the end of the world. Jesus Christ is in agony till the end of the world. Of course, including our own age, especially when we look to such countries as Africa and North Korea. Then what Shakespeare sees in all his plays, above all in King Lear, as the major source of his dramatic inspiration is the agony of Christ in the sufferings of his fellow Catholics in Elizabethan England. I think Shakespeare is the one author who has really succeeded in expressing all the sufferings of the Catholic recusants in Elizabethan England. Not only Catholic recusants, but the English people from the time Henry VIII took upon himself the title of supreme head of the Church in England. Very few people, I doubt it, anyone has really come to realize what happened in England during those 80 years, from the time of Henry VIII till the time Shakespeare came to compose King Lear. In such terms, we may recognize Lear not just as a morality everyman, nor just as, in his own words, every inch a king, but as King of England, not unlike Henry VIII in his rejection of Rome and the faith of Catholic Christendom personified in Cordelia. Maybe one might even look beyond Henry VIII to his 3 children by 3 successive wives, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. But there the comparison with Lear and his 3 daughters comes to an end, as the tragic reality fails to correspond to the dramatist's wishful thinking. And so, as Shakespeare says at the end of his epilogue to the Tempest, "And my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer." Indeed, the ending of King Lear, as of the existing plight of the Catholic recusants in England, is unutterably sad, if we look only to Lear with Cordelia at the end of Act 5. But we have to look with the dramatist to the ending not just of Act 5, but rather of Act 4, as he looks backward in time from the agony and passion to the resurrection of Christ. He's looking backwards from passion and death to resurrection. And there we look to beyond the tragedy of King Lear, to the final romances, especially Cymbeline and The Winter's Tale, when interpreted in the light of the reign of Henry VIII. These 2 plays reflect the reign of Henry VIII in a way that Shakespeare could not have done in the play of Henry VIII. In the play of Henry VIII, which he was writing in collaboration with John Fletcher, Shakespeare is skating over thin ice But the reality is what he presents in his two plays of Cymbeline and The Winter's Tale, in which the parallel with the reign of Henry VIII is barely disguised, and in which the dramatist seems to be making up for the sad ending of King Lear by looking forward from the sadness of the passion to the joy of the resurrection. That's the end of what I have to say. I'm sorry if I've spoken too long, but at least it's not yet midnight. Very much. It's the first time in my life I've ever received a standing ovation. If there's time for any questions, you're welcome to put them, provided Jamie is ready to accept questions.
Please, questions.
Is it a correct perception that it's taken a long time for scholars to recognize Catholic elements in Shakespeare? Is it
Anyhow, let me repeat the question. Why has it taken such a long time for people to recognize this hidden meaning in Shakespeare? And the answer is the Protestant interpretation of English history, the so-called Whig interpretation that has continued from the times of Elizabeth right up till, well, I would say the age of Eamon Duffy. English people have been brought up from school to accept the so-called Tudor myth. And in the Tudor myth begins with bluff King Hal and leads up to good Queen Bess as a climax, with an anticlimax in between in the form of Bloody Mary. And this is the way English people have been brought up right up till 20 years ago. And it still continues, I think, under as a kind of undercurrent. So there's that, and so the interpretation of Shakespeare has followed suit. And then Shakespeare himself, because he had to hide his Catholicism, English people have assumed that there is no Catholicism to hide. So Shakespeare is seemingly secular, but then it's always seemingly, not really. And so what I try to point out is that beneath all the seeming secularity of the plays, there is this reality of a meaning which applies very much to the contemporary Tudor situation. So I quite agree with Albert Benninger yesterday when he spoke about Shakespeare's lament for fallen England. And I think I see King Lear as the lament for, well, the end of Catholic hopes for the reconversion of England.
Father, what are your plans for your next 50 years of research?
extraordinarily interesting. But if we think of King Lear coming out with Cordelia, of King Lear, perhaps based on your comments, as a kind of a god of the father figure, or a figure of the Virgin Mary as a progenitor, doesn't it actually make it it's difficult to see it this sort of Trinitarian way? Because after all, King Lear has done something extraordinarily foolish. He's acted rashly. He's gone mad. So I guess, one image that comes to mind, for instance, is Marcion of Sinope, where you have the God the Father, the Old Testament God, is a kind of a demiurge who's characterized by kind of arbitrariness or cruelty, who's then replaced by Jesus, who is kind of a perfect figure, a figure without sin. So I'm just curious if the model entirely works out, and if you have any thoughts on my image from Marcion of Sinope of King Lear as this kind of god, as the father is a demiurge, and now the son replacing that demiurge in the form of Cordelia.
I'm afraid my ears are not of the best, and even when you use a microphone, I can't quite make out the point of your question, but I take it that you are considering other interpretations of King Lear, and it seems to me that Shakespeare's plays a bit of innumerable interpretations, but I think Shakespeare would admit of some more than others, and my way of interpreting not only King Lear but the other plays is that Shakespeare he always has in mind the situation of Elizabethan England. Shakespeare is not interested in King Lear. Shakespeare is not interested in Macbeth. Shakespeare is not interested in Othello. Shakespeare is not interested in any of his characters. Shakespeare is only interested in his own country, in his own time. It's exactly what George Bernard Shaw says about his own plays. He's not interested in Joan of Arc. He's using Joan of Arc as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. And I think this is why Shakespeare says in the sonnet, why write I still all one and the same? Shakespeare's always saying the same thing over and over again. And once we have this clue in mind, all kinds of hidden things in the plays come to light. And so that's why patience is needed also in the interpretation of Shakespeare, to be able to see each play one by one, even these promising plays, as Shakespeare's way of lamenting the situation of resident Catholics in Elizabethan England. Yes?
Thank you very much, Father Milward, for your talk tonight and for your decades of scholarship. And on this question of scholarship, do you think that there's anything in particular that those who are interested in the question of Shakespeare and Catholicism should now be looking into? That your work has begun something, that what had been overlooked really for centuries, except for the occasional person like Simpson, now people are paying attention to. As the conversation continues on, is there anything now more specific that's been overlooked in terms of Shakespearean religion? Whether this is, I don't know, anything in relation to particular controversies, to particular religious groups, etc., that people should now start looking into?
Yes. Well, this is something slightly different to the previous question, which I answered very briefly about with reference to divine providence. So I don't know how much longer I will survive. I've already promised my students at Sophia that I hope to survive at least to the age of 100, which means 15 more years. And then when I reach 100, I'll reconsider the matter. As for what I would recommend for younger students who are interested in Shakespeare as Catholic, it seems to me there's so much that still remains to be done. I just touched the surface in a book like Shakespeare the Papist. I've gone through all the plays, one by one, in hopefully chronological order, showing to what extent the few references to requisite import somehow affect the meaning of the play as a whole. And of course you have the lines set by Claire Asquith and Joe Pierce, David Beauregard, and quite a number of scholars. The one scholar I would strongly emphasize is John Closer, who is unable to come here today because he is, I think he's terminally ill. He has a very serious illness which prevents him from coming. But he wrote this fine book on Shakespearean Southwell. I think you pronounce his name Southwell, but in England we always say Southwell. And once I visited the city name, after which he is named in Nottinghamshire, and I stopped one of the people there and I asked, "Excuse me, could you tell me the name of this city?" He looked at me very strangely, and he said, "Why, Southwell, Southwell," because it's the northern accent. Anyhow, there's, you see, so this taboo against religion has lasted for so long that there now remains plenty of scope for considering each individual play more fully. Only I would like to emphasize what I meant called, or what T.S. Eliot calls the pattern in Shakespeare's carpet, which in fact, there's an unpublished manuscript to find with this very title, The Pattern in Shakespeare's Carpet, but I haven't been able to find a publisher so far because nowadays university publishers insist on an abundance of footnotes and abundance of bibliography, which presumably the author has not had time to read. So I think it's through the pattern in Shakespeare's carpet one comes to recognize this deep lying Catholicism. And then, not only for the individual plays, I have a friend in England who lives in Basingstoke called Tom Merriam, and he's applying the science of stylometrics to the play to see how often certain words or collocations of common words recur in certain plays. And he's more or less crossed out most of the history plays as probably as lacking in Shakespearean authenticity. Certainly the three parts of Henry VI and King John, possibly Richard III is more Marlowean than Shakespearean, and then even Henry V, and above all Henry VIII. But that leaves very few of the history plays intact, in spite of what the two editors say in their preface to the volume they produced. So we have to be grateful to those two editors for preserving half of Shakespeare's plays to posterity, but we have to be very critical of them for telling such a lie in their preface. Yes.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your comment of a few minutes ago about Shakespeare being interested only in his own time and only in his own country, and certainly in this conference, not to mention many of the books written by the speakers of this conference. We see such tremendous depths of meaning if you understand the specifics of the situation. But you've been teaching in Japan for more than 50 years now, and I assume that you've been speaking of Shakespeare with your students there. We in the English-speaking world do like to think of Shakespeare as being somehow universal, and do we flatter ourselves too much? Do the Japanese get it? Is it cross-cultural Or is it only Catholics who understand and appreciate the true nature of Shakespeare?
Well, I have the honor and privilege of teaching Japanese students at Sophia University, and there's a distinction between undergraduates and graduates. Undergraduates are in a much better position to understand Shakespeare because they come to the text of Shakespeare with fresh eyes and fresh minds. But once they become graduate students, they feel the obligation to read all the literature on the subject. And so this has the effect of brainwashing them. And so they're misled by all the authoritative authors in England and America, whereas the undergraduate students are fresh and simple, and I always get them to write their personal impressions of the plays we are studying in class. And I want them to write exactly what they think without consulting any other books, without copying any books. There was one student who actually went and copied one of my books. So, as a comment I wrote, either you're a fool or you think that I am a fool. It's been a great joy for me to teach in Japan. One of my little books for the Japanese was to have been entitled Is Shakespeare Japanese? The publisher was too literal-minded, and so he wanted to change the title to Shakespeare and the Japanese. If they had followed my suggestion, was Shakespeare Japanese, it would have become a bestseller. Publishers don't know their own business. And then I can pursue my researches by returning from time to time to England and America. And I managed to return to England and America without costing the society or the university or the province a cent, because I lead groups of Japanese to England and America and Europe, and it's a travel agent pays me to go with them as the travel guide, so I can economize. Yes.
Although there was always persecution of Catholics in Shakespeare's lifetime, the degree of persecution would vary from one year or one decade to another. Can you see a pattern of a greater degree of hiding of the Catholic point of view after increases in persecution, after the Armada, after the Gunpowder Plot, so forth?
The persecution that took place in England during the Elizabethan reign already began with the passing of the Act of Uniformity in Parliament in 1559. Shakespeare was born in 1564. Shakespeare didn't begin his dramatic career in London until about 1590. And already the persecution had been systematically increased. At first, the authorities were very lenient because the majority of the people were Catholic, still Catholic, but they were very clever or subtle in gradually stepping out the matter, especially with the Bull of Excommunication published by Pope Pius V in 1569 or 1570. That gave a kind of a means or justification for the authorities to pass more severe laws, and then with the coming of the seminary priests about 1575 onwards, and then especially with the coming of the Jesuits, what we call the Jesuit invasion of England in 1580, with Campion and Parsons, and there was a whole party that came with them. And then further laws and further proclamations were made against the Jesuits and seminary priests. And then Cecil, Sir William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, was very skillful in arranging plots, sham plots to show up the Catholics. A friend of mine, Francis Edwards, has written a very fine book on these sham plots that took place from year after year in Elizabeth's reign to keep the people regarding the Catholics as traitors. And Hamlet speaks of this bloody question that was first framed by Cecil against Campion and others at that time. If the King of Spain, with the approval of the Pope, were to invade England, which side would you take? Would you resist them as a loyal Englishman, or would you join the forces of the Catholic forces invading England? Well, that's a very difficult question for them to answer. Anyhow, there was a continual stepping up of pressure against the Catholics, and Shakespeare comes at the very climax of it all. And there was in 1593, there was a special proclamation of the Queen against the Catholics, which made life extremely difficult for them. They couldn't go more than so many miles from their homes. They were continually being discriminated against, and so then you have the climax with the death of Queen Elizabeth, and the hopes of the Catholics under James that at last they would receive toleration, but then it was too late. And so I think there's been this continual movement of suppression. To a certain extent, once James came to the throne, Catholics were full of hopes that the son of Mary Queen of Scots would at last grant a measure of toleration, but no. And that was what led to the Gunpowder Plot. And the accusers, the prosecutors at the time of the Gunpowder Plots admitted that if Catholics had seen any light of hope, they would not have combined to bring about this plot. And yet there's some evidence, which again Francis Edwards brought out in a third of his trilogy, that the Gunpowder Plot was secretly arranged by the government, by Sir Robert Cecil, to incriminate the Catholics. And ever since then, every November the 5th, sermons have been preached in churches, effigies of Guy Fawkes have been burnt on bonfires, just to keep alive the anti-popery spirit which continued in England right up to the time of my Anglican father married my Irish Catholic mother. Now, it doesn't appear so much on the surface, but it still lingers within the minds and hearts of many Englishmen, especially in the academic world. But now it's not so much anti-Catholic as anti-Christian. It's dangerous to be regarded as a pious Christian nowadays in Catholic English universities, so I hear, maybe also in America. Anyhow, thank you very much for it.
By no means